In my somewhat rushed video of yesterday, I discussed the fact that there seemed to be an accumulation of reports that Ukraine had suffered extremely heavy losses, in fact, disastrously heavy losses, in attacks that it had carried out on the 17th of June in the Zaporozhye area. And despite various claims that it had captured a place called Piatikhatki, a very small village, as I'm going to discuss shortly, that overall things didn't seem to have gone at all well, and in fact might even have gone catastrophically. Well, we've had a great deal more information over the last few hours as to exactly what did in fact happen on the 17th of June, and can I say that it looks as if the results were every bit as disastrous as the first reports said, and in fact this disaster, human disaster, military disaster I suspect as well over time, but certainly human disaster, huge Ukrainian losses, apparently continues even as I'm speaking. But let's first of all turn to what the Russian Ministry of Defense has told us about the events in the Zaporozhye front on the 17th of June. And this was their report, which was published yesterday. And they say the following: over the past 24 hours, the Ukrainian military continued to attempt offensive actions in Zaporozhye, South Donetsk, and Donetsk directions. The most active actions took place in Zaporozhye direction. The enemy, with up to 3 battalion tactical groups. Now, size of battalions can vary, but I'm going to say, give a figure for a Ukrainian battalion about 500 men. I know that in some militaries they can be bigger. Perhaps some Ukrainian battalions are smaller, but let's say 500 men. So we're talking about 1,500 men in total. Reinforced with tanks and armoured infantry vehicles under a smoke cover, made unsuccessful offensive attempts in several waves. Now notice the use of the expression waves. It's the first time I've seen it, I think, in Russian Defense Ministry reports. We've heard an awful lot about human wave tactics. Not quite sure that this is exactly what we are seeing, but certainly it does seem that Ukraine, for the moment at least, has given up on big armoured advances after the disasters of the first 2 weeks, and is now sending infantry moving forward, to a great extent unsupported. Made an unsuccessful attempt in several waves close to Novopokrovka, Novodanilovka, and Malaya Tokmachka. Now, I'm not exactly sure where all of these places are. Notice that this does not refer to the hamlet of Piatikhatki, which I will come to shortly. Anyway, it then says that the competent and decisive actions of the Vostok group of forces, aviation and artillery have repelled all enemy attacks. In addition, as a result of a complex shelling of 4 Ukrainian military reserves convoys near Malaya Tokmachka, 9 tanks, 10 infantry fighting vehicles, and up to 10 other armoured fighting vehicles were destroyed. Now, these would have been the units, this would have been the follow-up force in the event that the infantry broke through. And then we come to an absolutely astonishing paragraph. In the Zaporozhye direction, which includes Piatikhatki, the enemy losses, Ukrainian losses, were over 200 Ukrainian servicemen, 33 tanks, and 30 infantry fighting vehicles, and 35 armoured fighting vehicles. Now I'm going to focus first on those 200 Ukrainian servicemen that the Russian army claims, the Russian Defense Ministry claims Ukraine lost in the Zaporozhye direction. And I believe that we are in fact here talking about the general area where Pyatikhatki was located. Well, to the best of my knowledge, in Pyatikhatki itself, what happened was that a company of Ukrainian infantry, roughly 120 men, advanced on Pyatikhatki, seeking to capture this hamlet. And I want to say it is a small place. It did actually manage to capture the hamlet. The Russian forces that were located in the hamlet withdrew and let the Ukrainians move in. That brought the Ukrainian forces in Pyatikhatki into a semicircle of Russian fire. Russian heavy flamethrower vehicles, these terrifying TOS-1 multiple rocket launch systems, were then deployed to the scene. And there was basically an annihilation of fire. Now, I have seen one report, and it's only one report from a Russian channel. It's informal. You can take this as true or not, as the case may be, but it claims that Ukraine lost 120 men in this one place. Only 3 of the company survived. One of whom is the company commander, who is apparently captured and is in a state of shock. Now, of course, these are Russian reports. Western and Ukrainian reports have spoken of Pyatikhatki having been captured by Ukraine. It seems much more plausible that they were lured into a fire trap and that the Russians used this fire trap to destroy this company there. Now, I remember that many months ago, about a year ago, a US Marine Corps officer wrote a long study of Russian tactics in this conflict. He wrote it in the US Marine Corps Journal. He wrote it under a pseudonym, Marinus, and he spoke about the extent to which the Russians like to use these fire sacks, as I think he referred to them, these areas where they lure the Ukrainians in. The artillery and in this case, flamethrowers are all prepared. Every sort of single millimeter of ground has been measured and tested, and the sighting and ranging systems of the artillery have been presumably worked out in advance, and there's already a fire plan, and that enables the Russians to cause devastating losses upon any Ukrainian troops that are lured into this particular fire sack. And it seems to me that on the 17th of June, we had another particularly grisly example of that in Pyatikhatki. Anyway, the result was that the Ukrainians were effectively, well, they ceased to occupy Pyatikhatki. I gather that the Russians then perhaps sent some scouts back into the village. They didn't, as far as I can see, try to reoccupy it, but it was in the grey zone. And anyway, that was the conclusion of the battle. Now, Western reports yesterday in the British media spoke about Pyatikhatki being under Ukrainian control. As of the time when those articles appeared, my understanding is that it had ceased to be under Ukrainian control. As I said, there were no actual Ukrainian troops there. I'm not sure whether there were any Russian troops, but anyway, the place was clearly in the grey zone, where arguably it has always been. To reiterate again, a point I have said many times, all of these attacks, all of these battles that we're seeing taking place at the moment are not happening against the major Russian fortified lines. These are still between 10 and 15 kilometers to the south The Ukrainians are still trying to battle through this screening force that the Russians have ahead of those fortified lines in order to try to reach those fortified lines, and they are not yet successful in doing so, despite the fact that we are now currently in the third week of this offensive. In the meantime, they continue to take enormous losses. Now, before I discuss what happened in Piatikhatki and other places further, I'm going to finish the rest of this Russian Defense Ministry report, because it wasn't only in Zaporozhye that the fighting took place, it also took place on the Vremevka salient. And it said, in the South Donetsk direction, close to the Vremevka salient, the ledge in other words, as a result of decisive actions by Russian troops, aviation and artillery, 4 enemy attacks with a battalion tactical group have been repelled by Russian forces close to Novodonetskoye, Rovnopol and Novodovarovka, that's Zaporozhye region. And the enemy losses were up to 380 servicemen. Now, a battalion tactical group, perhaps 500 to 800 men, 380 losses out of that group. I mean, that seems a staggering number of losses. 35 tanks, 33 infantry fighting vehicles, including 2 Bradley vehicles, as well as 38 armoured fighting vehicles, including a Striker armoured personnel carrier, as well as 1 D-20 howitzer. Now, again, horrible losses in this area. Now, some people might correct me, maybe this is where the Battle of Piatikhatki happened, but if so, I think I've described it accurately enough. So we see these Ukrainian attacks, and the Russians claiming that the Ukrainians suffered very severe manpower losses. Now, 380 men dead, wounded, captured in the area of the Vremevka ledge, another 200 in Zaporozhye, I presume that means in the Orekhov area. And that was on the 17th of June, 580 men in total. Now, of course, these are Russian numbers. We don't know how accurate they are. We don't know how the Russian Defense Ministry collates its reports of casualties. They could be exaggerated, they could be very inflated, but there doesn't seem to be any doubt at all that the manpower losses are very, very high. And as I said, at Piatikhatki, at least, the Russian officers and soldiers were apparently shocked by the sight that they saw after the fight for this hamlet had finished. Now, before I discuss the equipment losses, which are perhaps the most dramatic things of all, I want to just say a few more things about Piatikhatki. Now, I have referred to the troops who were fighting there, the infantry that were fighting there, as Russian troops. I understand, I might be wrong here, but I understand that they're mainly Ossetians. In other words, they're probably reservists called up for the as part of Putin's big call-up of last September, and most of them come from Northern Ossetia, which is a republic within the Russian Federation in the Northern Caucasus. It is, by the way, the place where Beslan, the place where back in the early 2000s, a jihadi raiding party captured a school, and where there was terrible loss of life amongst the children of the school, where Beslan is located. It is in fact in Northern Ossetia. And of course Northern Ossetia is connected to Southern Ossetia, which most countries around the world recognize still as part of Georgia, but which Russia recognizes as an independent country. And it was over South Ossetia that the 2008 Russia-Georgia War, the brief Russia-Georgia War of 2008, was fought over. So these are not Russians, these are not ethnic Russians, they are a distinct and proudly distinct nationality with a very ancient history. Very ancient history indeed. They refer to themselves, by the way, as Alani, Alans. It was the ancient word used for them by many Byzantine writers. And before that, during the period of the Roman Empire, they were sometimes referred to as the Yazyges, who were part of the Sarmatian Confederation. In other words, they are the descendants of the Sarmatians. Just mentioning all of this, I do think this is an interesting fact, historical fact. Sarmatians do still exist, and they're fighting in this zone of conflict, and they've just inflicted this terrible defeat on the Ukrainians where they were fighting. So just saying all of this, I think that is an interesting fact in itself. The Russian army consists of forces of many, many different nationalities, and they all seem to work together, and they all seem to work proudly together. Now, let's deal with something else, which is Piatichatki. Is this an important place? The name actually means 5 houses. So I'm not saying that there are only 5 houses in Piatichatki, but it doesn't seem to be a particularly large place. And I've actually had some information now about the villages, the various villages that the Ukrainians at various times claim to have captured. And Novodonetskoye, which, by the way, the Ukrainians did capture briefly, but which I understand is once more under Russian control. Novodonetskoye, before the war, had 327 inhabitants. Makarovka, which Ukraine also captured, but which I understand is also, again, under Russian control, had 258. Blagodatnoye is a bit bigger. Well, it is bigger. It had 1,097. Storozhevoye had 96. Neskuchnoye had 644. Lobkovoye, which is, I think, still contested, had 99. Novodarovka had 51. Levanoye, which is another place that has been fought over and which the Ukrainians claim to have captured at various times. Well, I've seen satellite pictures of it. It's a farm building with various outlying buildings clustered around it. These are very small places. And by the way, they're uninhabited places because, as I discussed, before the Ukrainians launched their offensive, the Russians evacuated all of the people who lived there. So they're uninhabited, they're empty villages, relatively small places. Blagodatnoye appears to be the only one with any significant size. Some of them are extremely small, and I suspect that Piatichatki is one of the very small ones. Anyway, just saying. So this is what all this fighting has been about. It's not, so it seems to me, anything of any great significance or moment, and it continues to be far ahead, kilometers ahead of the main Russian defense lines, which the Ukrainians have not yet reached. Now, I've said that one can't be very sure about Ukrainian manpower losses. The Russians give figures for Ukrainian manpower losses. How can we be sure that these manpower losses are correct? Well, the answer is we can't, and we mustn't assume that they are. And I think we can take all of these figures with some degree of skepticism, though there doesn't seem to be much doubt that Ukraine did lose lots of men in those attacks on the 17th of June. But consider the armoured vehicle losses. Now, the Russians say that in the Zaporozhye direction, and this includes the area around Orekhov, Ukraine lost 33 tanks, 30 infantry fighting vehicles, 35 armoured fighting vehicles. And in the South Donetsk area, in the area around the Vremevka Ledge, they lost 35 tanks, another 33 infantry fighting vehicles, including 2 Bradleys, and 38 armoured fighting vehicles, including a Striker. That is an astonishing number of vehicles. That's 68 tanks lost in a single day. Even by World War II standards, in the middle of a battle, that is an awful lot of tanks to lose. Now, notice that the Russians do not claim that these were Leopard 2s or Challenger 2s, so these are presumably T-72s and T-64s. There's some reports that Ukraine is now also committing T-62s and T-55s, earlier generation 1950s and 1960s Soviet vehicles, to this battle. But nonetheless, we're talking about 68 tanks, and also, according to the Russians, 63 infantry fighting vehicles. Only 2 of those apparently were Bradleys, so again, a reasonable guess is that most of these are Soviet-era BMPs, perhaps leavened out with other infantry fighting vehicles supplied from Eastern Europe. But anyway, whatever. And interestingly enough, amongst the 73 armoured fighting vehicles, we see that a lone Striker armoured personnel carrier was apparently also claimed by the Russians as destroyed. Now, I am assuming that the Russians do have pictures of these destroyed vehicles. I mean, we are talking about large vehicles. It's probably more easy to count their destruction on the battlefields. You can film them with drones and things of that kind, and we know that the Russians have saturated the battlefields with drones. Apparently there was no rain, so that there would have been lots of drones operating both during the night and the day, and the drones have night vision devices. So I presume that the Russians have a reasonably accurate tally of the number of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and armoured fighting vehicles that they destroy. It's not to say that they never make mistakes. They confused a combine harvester with a Leopard 2, as we all know, on the first day of the offensive. But after that particular debacle, I would have thought that they would be double-checking their targets. And it does seem as if they did knock out very large numbers of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and other vehicles. And one wonders how this was done, because, as I said, the reports all speak about light infantry. The Ukrainians now trying to advance on these Russian positions with light infantry. Again, my guess is that some of this is being achieved by Russian artillery strikes. As I said, the Russians advanced into this area in January. They didn't control this area before January. They appear to have planned it out as a killing zone. They planted their minefields. They charted they would have charted every single location. They would have developed a very complex fire plan for the area. And it's likely that artillery has played a role in destroying some of these vehicles. perhaps mines have done. I mean, these minefields that the Russians have planted everywhere are, I suspect, principally intended to destroy tanks and armoured vehicles. They might be easier for infantry to skirt round. Notice that these attacks appear to have happened to some extent at night, but also during the day, but it's conceivable that the infantry would have been able to maneuver around these mines, especially if they're scattered on the surface. But armoured vehicles might be more exposed to destruction from mines, and of course artillery has been used. And the other thing that has been used a lot by the Russians are helicopter gunships. Now, there's a huge amount written about helicopter gunships, that the Russians are operating these by day and night. The Kamov 52s, these are the ones that attract the most attention. At night, I suspect, by the way, that a lot of the operations are actually carried out by Mi-28s, which are apparently specifically designed to operate at night. I know that they have been used on the battlefields. But anyway, one way or the other, they have been apparently extremely effective in destroying these tanks. So anyway, however it was done, lots of armoured vehicles the Russians claim to have destroyed. And again, maybe these figures are inflated to some extent, though I would personally, because these are large objects, easy to detect, and the Russians have all of these satellites now monitoring the battlefronts, and with their synthetic aperture radars, they can certainly track knocked out tanks if they have to, though it should be said the satellites move rapidly, so they're not over the battlefield very long. Any particular satellite is not over the battlefield for any particularly long time. But anyway, I would have thought the Russians have a reasonably accurate idea of how many armoured vehicles that they are destroying. And just to say that there's been an interesting article in The Drive about one of these American magazines, which basically seems to be written for US servicemen and their families, which describes lots of things. Actually, they're quite, sometimes some of these articles, some of these publications can be very informative, more informative, in my opinion, than a lot of the so-called political journalism is. But anyway, it describes the very effective way in which the Russians are using their helicopter gunships on the battlefields. And it also makes the point that Ukraine seems to be critically short of air defense systems in the area of the offensive, which leaves the troops, Ukrainian troops and armoured vehicle convoys, naked to attacks by these helicopter gunships and other Russian aviation forces. So, and the article sort of admits also, by the way, that there is really little that can be done about this. The US and the Western powers generally have neglected developing these systems, systems that are intended to protect troops on the front lines. The West doesn't have an equivalent to the Panzer, which the Russians use both as a point defense system to protect particular locations, and also on the front lines, nor does it have equivalents to the Tor and Osa short-range anti-aircraft systems, and the Strela 10 and all of these things that the Russians have in abundance. The Ukrainians also had some of these systems before the war, obviously older versions, and they never had the Panzer. But apparently most of these have either run out of ammunition or have been destroyed by the Russians. There are few Western equivalents that can be sent to the battlefronts and which can survive there, with Lancet drones hunting to look for these particular systems and probably making their destruction a priority. So the result is that the Ukrainian troops, as they try to advance, are very heavily affected by these Russian helicopter tactics. Well, I've no doubt that that is another part of the explanation for these massive equipment losses. But again, to reiterate, even if these figures are inflated, which perhaps they are, the losses do seem to be extraordinarily high, and it does call into question the extent to which Ukraine can persist with this offensive. Now, over the course of yesterday and today, Ukraine has continued its attacks. There were more attacks yesterday in much the same areas that the attacks on the 17th happened. The outcome seems to have been much the same. It doesn't seem as if Ukrainian losses were quite as high. And there does seem to be another attack in the Piatikhatki area by Ukraine taking shape this morning, though again it seems as if once more the Ukrainian forces, the troops there, are suffering very, very heavy losses, and again Russian artillery and these terrifying flamethrower vehicles are again operating, and so no doubt are the helicopter gunships and all of these things. Now, if anything changes, if the Ukrainians achieve some more dramatic successes, well, you'll probably hear about them before this video appears, but I can only again discuss what is going on as of the time of the making of this video. It seems Ukraine suffered a disastrous losses on the 17th, heavy losses on the 18th. It's trying again today on the 19th. It doesn't seem to be making very much progress at the moment. And as I said, we're now well into the third week of this offensive. And doubts about the progress of the offensive are now starting to proliferate. So we've had a video appearing on Sky News. Sky News was the British TV channel which broadcast that notorious video. I haven't watched it, by the way. I barely ever watch Sky News, but Sky News broadcast that notorious video in which a British military expert apparently tried to claim that one of the pictures of a burning Leopard 2 was actually fabricated by the Russians. And anyway, it says that Ukraine counteroffensive loses ground, and it says that Ukraine's counteroffensive is losing momentum against Russian fortifications, and airstrikes and artillery attacks are reportedly slowing Ukraine's advance, and it doesn't look terribly optimistic. And I gather that there's been more and more articles about this appearing all over the media. In the West, there are various plans to try and come up with some kind of attacks to redress the situation. And sometimes some of these Ukrainian attacks do get through. There was an attack apparently with Storm Shadow missiles, which did manage to destroy a railway junction in the Russian rear. The satellite confirmation of this, there's no doubt that this did happen. There's reports that the Ukrainians, talking with the British, are now trying or planning some kind of major strike with Storm Shadow missiles against the Russian airfield at Berdyansk, where at least 20 of these helicopter gunships are based. I would have thought that airfield would be particularly heavily defended, especially and specifically with Panzer and Tor point defense systems. It might be difficult to break through, and it would probably only be possible if a large number of Storm Shadows were launched against this airfield. And maybe Ukraine does have that number, but maybe it also doesn't have the aircraft needed to launch it. Anyway, I would have thought that the Russians would, well, they're certainly aware of this talk, and presumably they've prepared some plan to counter it if this attack comes. Up to this point, throughout this offensive, the Russians have appeared very well prepared. Now, there are lots of rumours speculating about Ukrainian troops refusing to advance. There's also rumours, which I can't confirm, that Ukrainian troops not only have lost confidence in the Leopard 2 and are extremely unwilling to go into battle with it, but that they have actually been causing breakages in their own Leopard 2s to prevent these tanks, to prevent them being ordered to go back on the attack with these tanks. Now, I don't know whether that is true or not. It could be disinformation. Disinformation happens a great deal in war, and one can't be absolutely sure about this one way or the other. But anyway, it's something to bear in mind. There are reports to this effect circulating. It could be that they are, as I said, Russian disinformation, or it could be that things like this are indeed happening. There have been genuine recorded instances earlier in the war of Ukrainian military formations complaining about orders to go into battle and about the fact that the casualties they suffer are out of all proportion to anything that can possibly be achieved. So, to reiterate it again, in the third week of the offensive, the Ukrainians still haven't managed to penetrate the forward area that the Russians control. They haven't yet reached the fortified lines that the Russians have. Not the really big fortified lines, but even the intermediate fortified line that lies in advance of them. It's difficult to say how many of their vehicles have been lost. There's some claims now that the number of Western supplied vehicles has increased to about 40% of the total. I think this is mostly wheeled armoured vehicles. There's a curious reference in that Russian Defense Ministry report to a single striker vehicle having been destroyed. And I do wonder whether that is a misattribution of another type of vehicle, because there doesn't seem to me to be much sense in sending one striker vehicle by itself into battle. Or perhaps the Ukrainians are in fact sending several striker vehicles into battle, but the group that was deployed with them basically turned tail and withdrew after the first one was destroyed. I've been getting lots of people telling me that the strikers are a troubled vehicle. They're not easy to operate at all, and it could be that the troops themselves have little confidence in them. Just guessing. That's pure guess. So anyway, 40%, I've seen one claim that up to 40% of the Bradleys have been destroyed. I'm sure that that is an overstatement. But anyway, no doubt lots of vehicles have been destroyed. Large numbers of tanks are being destroyed. Very little progress, no real progress in fact, is being made. And I do have to ask myself again, how much longer can this go on for? Belitsky, who is the Russian acting governor of Zaporozhye region, spoke about an 8-week offensive before the Ukrainians finally fade out. He may be right. I have to say that given the current rate of loss, I think that any hopes, even within Kiev or Washington or London or Brussels or Berlin or Paris, of a Ukrainian breakthrough to the Sea of Azov, they must by now be fading. And that might explain, by the way, some really rather strange comments that Zelensky and Reznikov, the Ukrainian defense minister, have each made. Zelensky has said that all the Patriot missile systems are intact. There's been no damage. There's been not a single one has been knocked out. Maybe he's telling the truth. Maybe they have managed to avoid losing any Patriot systems, but it does seem a rather strong claim, especially given that even the US admitted that one Patriot system was damaged, and we've seen satellite photos that appear to suggest more extensive damage than that. But anyway, he says that so far Kiev's defences are intact, though he admits that this isn't true in other places across Ukraine. And in fact, going back to discussions made by people like Simplicius the Thinker, it does seem that Ukraine has been obliged to concentrate most of its assets, air defense assets, to Kiev itself. And there may be a reason for this, which I will come to shortly. Anyway, Reznikov, for his part, says that not a single Storm Shadow missile has been shot down. They've all supposedly got through and hit their targets. Again, he may be telling the truth. It may be that the Russians are exaggerating when they talk about Storm Shadows being regularly shot down. I have no way of corroborating, one way or another, who is telling the truth on this matter. But I would have thought that if this really were the case, by now, after several weeks of use of the Storm Shadows, and after repeated Russian claims to have shot down Storm Shadows, I would have thought that the Ukrainians would be more forward in insisting that all their Storm Shadows were getting through. Maybe they have been, and I've missed it. Who's to say? But anyway, I have to say that, again, I take that claim with a healthy dose of skepticism. Now, let's return to the attacks on Kiev, the Russian attacks on Kiev. And we can see that some of these attacks are definitely getting through, despite what Zelensky said. Now, there was the satellite pictures of the damage done to the Zhuliany airfield on the day following the Russian Kinzhal attack on the Patriot systems that we know are based there. And at least some missiles clearly did get through, and there were considerable, very large missile impacts shown on those photos. There was also the attack on the GUR building, the building of Ukrainian military intelligence. And here I must immediately, and with apology, confirm a mistake that I made. I said yesterday that apparently Stern, the German magazine, said that they had discussions with some of the doctors who were treating General Budanov, Kirilo Budanov, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, in a German hospital, and I said that looked like it provided strong evidence that Budanov was indeed hurt. Well, in fact, Stern, at the same time as I was making that claim, was publishing an outright denial. They were saying that the story had absolutely no truth whatsoever. So you can scratch that. Clearly, Stern has no information about what has happened to Budanov. It's curious who, in that case, was circulating that rumour and why they picked on Stern particularly. But anyway, there we go. So Budanov's fate, again, remains mysterious, as perhaps Zaluzhny's does. In Zaluzhny's case, as I say, he's clearly still alive. In Budanov's case, I don't know one way or the other. I suspect that he is probably alive, but he's clearly gone to ground. As I said, I go back to my earlier theory. I suspect that he's been ordered to remain silent, and it could be that the Ukrainians are now worried about the fact that Budanov is apparently a Russian target, so that may also explain some of the secrecy about his whereabouts. So we had the attack on Ukrainian military intelligence. There's been at least one other attack on some kind of decision-making center that we don't know very much about. And then there was another attack the other day, and this was the attack that took place on the same day that the African delegation was in in Kiev. The Africans were baffled by it because they saw no sign of explosions or anything like that. But anyway, it does seem as if a building was hit some distance outside Kiev and was very badly damaged, according to some reports. And there's been some mystery as to what it was. And there's reports that it was a Ukrainian Defense Ministry installation. Well, I've had a very interesting email from someone, I'm not going to say who, but someone who has shown themselves in the past to be well informed about these things, and who does seem to be fairly well informed about what buildings the Russians are attacking in Kiev. And this person, I'm not going to disclose this person's identity. This person says that the building that was struck was a situational awareness center used for the main battlefield in a particular area of operations. And the point about these battlefield, these centers is apparently it's based on a concept pioneered by the United States, and the United States has one in Florida and probably various other places, and Israel also has such a system. And by the way, I know for a fact that the Russians also do, by the way. There's a particularly large such center in Moscow that I'm aware of. Anyway, the point about these centers and their existence in Ukraine are not a secret. This person has provided me with links to open source articles which refer to these situational awareness systems. Apparently they go by the name of Delta. That what they do is they bring together information from all sorts of places, satellites being a major source, and they integrate it and they package it, and they enable Ukraine to get a very accurate idea of the state of the battlefield, the ongoing state of the battlefield, and to provide command and control to the troops who are on this particular battlefield. And this person has said that one of the roles of this situational awareness center would be to provide targeting coordinates to HIMARS and other smart weapon systems, including, of course, Storm Shadows and JDAMs and all of those things. And as I said, there are apparently 3 of them in Ukraine. The one that has just been attacked. Another apparently in a mountainous area, located in an old Soviet air base. So presumably the Russians know where that is. And apparently there's yet another one somewhere, and there's some secrecy or mystery as to exactly where that is. But this one was located close to Kiev, and these three centers are absolutely essential for Ukraine's effective operation of its war, and one of them apparently has now been attacked and destroyed. Now, this is what this source gave me. He's been consistently reliable up to now, and I'm assuming that this is correct. But of course, if others want to push back and come up with some alternative theory, then they're welcome to do so. I can easily see how such a building both fits into the Russian concept of a decision-making center, and why it would be a priority for the Russians to destroy it. Now, and I suspect that before long, they'll be hunting the other two, which are not located close to Kiev. One's in a mountainous region. It's presumably in western Ukraine. So, that's probably near Lvov or some place like that. So that apparently is the nature of the building that was destroyed. And by the way, this brings me to the topic of the latest sitrep done by Simplicius the Thinker. He talks with some exasperation about the fact that the Russians allowed themselves to fall behind in this sort of thing, that their presence, their space program has fallen well behind where it was, even in the first decade of the 21st century. It is the case that satellite launches have picked up in recent months, and that the Russians do seem to be acting to repair the deficiencies that they have. But anyway, he wonders how this was allowed to happen, and he speculates about incompetence and about a lack of priority given to this key area by Putin. I'm going to suggest my own theory, which is a different one from the one that he gives. I suspect that the fundamental reason this has happened is because Russian funding for its space program was bled dry by the colossal enterprise of building the Vostochny Cosmodrome space launch center in Russia's Far East. There's a huge operation, a massive exercise in trying to build a new space center. There was worries that the main one in Baikonur in Kazakhstan, of which Russia still has a lease, might eventually be lost. The previous Kazakh government under Nursultan Nazarbayev seemed to be edging towards the point of trying to oust the Russians from Baikonur. I get the sense that with the new government under President Tokayev, those concerns have abated. But anyway, at some point the Russians decided to build this huge cosmodrome. It has been an extraordinarily troubled operation. It's taking a huge amount of time. It's absorbed enormous resources. There's been multiple problems with corruption and poor management. And in fact, gradually, steadily, this thing is being finished. And eventually, no doubt, we will get to the point where it is fully operating. Satellites are now starting to be launched from this place, but it's still nowhere near complete, but we are heading towards some kind of completion. And then, of course, the Russians would have complicated matters even more, because even as they were pressing forward with the development of this cosmodrome, which, as I said, would have absorbed a huge amount of resources, they were also launching a huge and equally complex operation to replace all their tried and tested rockets developed in the 1960s with a whole new generation of much more efficient and reliable rockets, or at least maybe not more reliable, but at least more ecologically friendly rockets like the Angara. And that also has taken a huge amount of time and absorbed enormous resources. So I'm not going to discuss in this area the Russian space program. As I said, it's not been an entirely happy story, or even a happy story. I suspect that gradually, step by step, the problems there are being sorted out. There were some very poor personnel choices as to who to manage this thing. But anyway, suffice to say that the Russians do have a situational awareness center of their own in Moscow, and probably more than one. And they have been launching more satellites recently, including military satellites. So they probably now do have at least as much information about the state of the battlefield as the Ukrainians do, who are obviously getting their information from the United States. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about that. Of course, if you don't have a situational awareness center, all this information becomes a great deal less useful. If the Russians knock out all three on Ukrainian territory, I suspect that an attempt will be made to set up another one, probably in Poland or somewhere in Eastern Europe, or even in Central Europe, for all I can say. But it will cause more disruption, and having this centre located outside Ukraine might create its own set of problems. So, there we go. Now, that is my summary of the situation overall, but there are two topics I do want to return to, as well as talking about space program and other things. Simplicius the thinker again discusses the state of the negotiations, the nature of the negotiations that took place in March and early April last year between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and the way in which Putin provided the draft agreement that the Ukrainians initialed, which was sent to the Russians, and which the Ukrainians eventually reneged on. And I think that there are a lot of misunderstandings about what was agreed at this time, and I think this has been created by a great deal of confusion. And I want to reiterate again, I think people are basing too much of what they think they know from Western media reports that have appeared long after these negotiations in effect failed. The reports were fairly extensively covered at the time. The discussions were fairly extensively covered at the time, both in the Financial Times, which was being briefed by Ukrainian officials, and in the Russian media as well. Now, just to reiterate again, I don't think that the Russians actually agreed to pull back to the February 2022 ceasefire lines, the ones that existed before the special military operation was launched. I think what happened was that the Russians and the Ukrainians did not actually discuss formal territorial changes at all. I think the Russians understood that in March 2022, April 2022, it would have been asking too much for the Ukrainians to formally recognize that Crimea and Donbass was lost. The Russians at the time were indeed eager for a settlement. The entire way in which the military operation in February, March 2022 was conducted, and I discussed that, and we discussed that on the Duran also, at the time, was intended to achieve a diplomatic compromise. At that time, the Russians were not seeking a military victory in Ukraine. They were seeking to push the Ukrainians into negotiations. So, and that determined the style in which the Russians were conducting the war in the first weeks of the war. So, the idea was that Ukraine would be granted security guarantees by Russia, which would have a right, as part of those security guarantees, to prohibit deployment of outside forces on any scale on Ukrainian territory, even to conduct exercises. And it was also agreed between Russia and Ukraine that the Donbass, and I here mean the entire Donbass, the entire territory of the Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts and Crimea, would not be covered by those security guarantees. So, in effect, without recognizing Russian sovereignty of the Donetsk and Lugansk and of Crimea, but by agreeing that these territories would not be covered by security guarantees, Ukraine was in effect, de facto, accepting that these territories, Donetsk and Lugansk and Crimea, would fall under the control, the physical control of Russia. That was a way of freezing the issue. Ukraine would give an undertaking not to join NATO. It would embed in its constitution a provision for neutrality. There would be significant reduction in the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. And this is the part of the agreement where we've now had some leaks following the meeting between Putin and the African delegation. And we see that, in fact, the Russians were pressing for a very, very steep reduction in the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. Indeed, it would have been, Ukrainian armed forces would have been reduced to a skeleton force of around 85,000 men. And that would, in effect, have neutralized Ukraine. And it would certainly no longer have been a danger to Russia had that happened. And in return, Russia would actually have supported Ukraine's application to join the European Union. And I found that surprising at the time, but in a subsequent meeting between himself and the Kazakh President Tokayev, Putin, in effect, actually admitted this. Now, I doubt that the European Union would, in that case, have been in any hurry to admit Ukraine, and perhaps that is the Russian calculation. But the Russians did say that they would not only not object to Ukraine applying to join the European Union, but that the Russians would actually support that application. That, in broad contours, there was still, I think, a great deal of work to be done. There were still issues about the purging of Ukraine of its ultra-right ideology and its adherents, about protections for Russian speakers. There apparently some progress was made on that front as well. But in outline, that was the agreement that was reached in March and April. And again, what I think many people don't know is that they assumed that Boris Johnson persuaded Zelensky to call off that agreement when he visited Kiev. In fact, what actually happened was that the moment Boris Johnson got details of what that agreement was about, he telephoned Zelensky. This was confirmed in an article by the Sunday Times some days before he actually physically visited Kiev. Anyway, he telephoned Zelensky, and he told Zelensky that for the British, this agreement was unacceptable, and that Britain, which according to this draft agreement would be one of the guarantor powers, would refuse to provide guarantees to Ukraine on the basis of the agreement that had just been initialed. And the United States apparently took the same view, and Naftali Bennett, the Israeli Prime Minister, has actually said that the reason he was given by the US as to why they were not prepared to support this agreement, to reach this compromise, was because it would have a bad effect, give a bad impression to China. It would give the Chinese the idea that if they pushed hard militarily over Taiwan or in other places, they would achieve progress that way. So, there you are. You can see that that was the nature of the agreement, provided, I think, much of the uncertainty and many of the mysteries that people have, much of the misunderstandings that have happened, as I said, derive from subsequent reporting. Now, it's been suggested that there was never any real prospect of this agreement being reached, that the Russians were not really negotiating in good faith, that they always expected that this agreement would fail. I had thought that over the course of the negotiations. I thought that these negotiations, which were being conducted by the Russians at the time with the Ukrainians, that the Russians were actually engaging with them in anticipation of their eventual failure. I have changed my views about this. I think that in Putin's mind, he wanted the conflict to be ended as quickly as possible. He wasn't sure how well Russia's economy would perform under the sanctions, and I think he also gave assurances to the Russian military that this is what he wanted to do, because I think he and the Russian military had no real appetite for a prolonged war in Ukraine, which they knew would be very difficult. And I don't think the Russians had prepared militarily for a long war in Ukraine, and I think that also partly explains some of the problems which arose when the conflict started, the way in which the entire Russian military operation gave a look of having been very improvised and put together in a great hurry. So that's my understanding of the negotiations, and as I said, it's based on my recollection and my observation of what happened at the time. And as I said, the negotiations failed. The Russians waited and hoped to see whether there was any chance that they could be revived. I think they still hope that that might happen up to and beyond the fall of Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, when Ukraine instead embarked on its counteroffensives in August and September. I think at that point the Russians finally concluded that there was only one way of ending the war, and that was by committing to a military victory. By this point, the Allies, or Russia's friends, I should say, around the world, had been brought on side. The Russians had been surprised and relieved that their economy and their society was holding up to the sanctions blow far more successfully than they ever imagined. And the result was that in August and September, especially following a summit meeting that took place in Samarkand, when Putin had the opportunity to explain things to all the various leaders there, including Modi and Xi Jinping. Anyway, the long and the short of it was that at that point, when he returned to Moscow, Putin was able to order the mobilization, which he'd resisted up to that point, and started to create a unified command structure around first Surovikin and then Gerasimov to conduct the war, and to conduct the war until victory. So I think this is the story. Now, where I do agree with Simplicius the thinker and with others is that I think that when Putin released this draft peace plan to the African leaders, and the Kremlin readout shows that he received them with extraordinary politeness, as is always the case. When he released this draft peace plan, he fully intended to make clear to the Africans that the Russians have been down this road already. They made major efforts to try to agree peace with Ukraine. Those attempts ended in total failure. The Ukrainians went back on all that they promised. He repeated that the Russians pulled their forces from Kiev and Chernigov because they decided that they did that as a confidence-building measure, a de-escalation measure in anticipation of this agreement. And by the way, Simplicus the thinker here, I think, makes some very good and valid points, which again correspond closely with my recollection that Ukraine was indeed launching various attacks on the Russian forces near Kiev and Chernigov, but was making little progress. My recollection is that the Russians, just before they pulled back from this area, actually captured an important town in Kiev region, where the people who had been evacuated from Chernobyl following the accident there in 1986 had been resettled. And I also remember that there were reports that they were tightening their grip around Chernigov. So I don't think that they were pushed out of these places. Maybe they did want to withdraw from them to focus instead on Donbass. Who's to say? But I certainly don't think that they were defeated and driven from the battlefields. But anyway, I'm not going to revisit this topic now. The point is, Putin reiterated that he made these big concessions, that he came up with this agreement, that it didn't work, and he's basically telling the Africans, why should I expect that there would be any different outcome this time? And I suspect he's also telling the Africans this, which is that Ukraine is incapable of making its own decisions. He specifically, the Russian readout shows that he specifically told the Africans that Ukraine reneged on the draft agreement it had reached under US and British pressure. So, given that that is so, what confidence is there that that pressure won't be applied again? And for all I know, Kiev might have told the African leaders in the private parts of their discussion that the only way that this can be settled through a diplomatic compromise and not on the battlefield is if there's a fundamental change in attitude in Washington, not just about the war, but about the general security situation in Europe. And that certainly it's important for them to visit Ukraine, where, as I said, as I said yesterday, their meeting with Zelensky apparently did not go well. But it is also important for them, ultimately, to talk with the United States, which is where the real problems are. And whether the African leaders are prepared to do that, we shall see. But I suspect at some point they will. Jeffrey Sachs made the point in the live stream that we made with him on the Duran a week or so ago, that the fact that the global south has been so negative about Western policy over the conflict in Ukraine is eventually going to have a cumulative effect and might eventually start to sway opinion in Washington. If the United States feels that it's losing ground around the world and is coming under pressure from around the world to agree to a diplomatic compromise, that might add to the weight of opinion in Washington that is already seeking, for other reasons, that same compromise. And we shall see. But President Lula, the African states, Indonesia, India, China, they're all essentially saying the same thing. This war has to end in a compromise. The way this offensive is going to make them harden their views. That means that Ukraine is going to have to cede territory, and that might be a difficult thing for the West and certainly Ukraine to accept, but it could be that over time this diplomatic weight will grow to the point where it does change minds in Washington. But in the meantime, I think that the Russians have told themselves that there's no point in expecting that to happen, and that what they're going to do instead is that they're going to focus on the war itself and achieving whatever battlefield victories come to them. And for the moment, I think that they sense that in the south, Ukraine's offensive is not going well. We've even seen, as I said, Western media reports now increasingly acknowledging this. And of course, in Kupiansk, it seems that they're continuing to make progress, though as is always the way with the Russians, they make progress slowly. So that is where I finish this program today. I should say that tomorrow, provided other things don't happen which push it back, I'm going to try and talk about Tony Blinken's trip to Beijing. The Chinese did eventually receive him. He's had meetings with Wang Yi and Qin Gang. I've read the Chinese readouts. It's clear to me that there's been no substantive progress on any of the issues that exist between China and the United States. Both Wang Yi and Qin Gang apparently read a stiff lecture to Blinken about the fact that US foreign policy towards China is severely misconceived and is getting China completely wrong. There was talk about setting up some kind of a working party to try to work through problems. I suspect Blinken came up with that particular idea. I think that the Chinese always would agree to that, but I don't think they have any great expectations of this working party. And interestingly enough, and from what I could see, there doesn't seem to have been any real discussion of the situation with respect to Ukraine. At least the Chinese readouts, and by the way, for me, the more important of these two is the one with Wang Yi, who, unlike Qin Gang, is a member of the Communist Party's Politburo. But anyway, neither of these two readouts, as far as I can see, mention Ukraine at all. So if Blinken came along to Beijing hoping to get the Chinese to put pressure on the Russians to modify their stance over Ukraine, well, the Chinese presumably will have given very short shrift to that and will have told Blinken that really isn't acceptable. But anyway, I'm going to discuss this important, or perhaps not so important, but anyway, interesting meeting or visit by Blinken, hopefully tomorrow. And in the meantime, this is where I end today's video. Can I remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work if you wish via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You should certainly check out our shop where we've got lots of new wonderful products, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things, rucksacks, bottles, all those great things there which you can buy. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day, and, well, see you tomorrow.